Good evening. I am Brooke Clement, and as Acting Director of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library and Museum, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's event, Wine in the White House, A History. I would like to take a moment to wish each of you a safe and happy holiday season. As we move into 2021, we certainly look forward to a time we can once again open the doors of the library and museum and welcome you all in person. And while we're not there yet, our staff has been working hard to schedule some exciting virtual programs for early next year. Watch your emails over the next few weeks for program information. I have been waiting all week for tonight's event. Believe me, please join me in welcoming Claire Schubert, Director of Engagement and Programming with the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, to introduce tonight's program.
Thank you, Brooke, and happy holidays to you and all of our fantastic museum staff. Well, with the year marked by distance that keeps us less than social, as a foundation, we've still found ways to reach out, to connect, and even to have a little fun. It's our hope that this evening's program will provide not only education and rich discussion, but also some much needed holiday cheer. Our evening will be moderated by Mr. Gleaves Whitney, a presidential historian and the executive director of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation. Gleaves will be leading our lively conversation with Mr. Fred Ryan as we learn about his latest book, Wine in the White House, A History. And I know some of you are tasting along at home with us. So throughout the evening, Mr. Adam Fortuna will provide us with tasting tips and notes on the 3 wines he has selected to complement our discussion. So if you are tasting with us at home, you have 3 beautiful bottles waiting for you tonight. We'll be starting with the sparkling wine, and now is a great time to get all 3 of those bottles open and ready for celebrating. At any point during the presentation, please feel free to submit a question for any of our speakers. If you're watching through our Zoom webinar, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And if you're watching us on Facebook tonight, please drop your question in the comments. Near the end of our evening together, I'll be rejoining the group to share those audience questions. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Gleaves. Cheers.
Well, thank you, Claire, for your introduction. And thanks also to the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation's partners, the Ford Presidential Library and Museum, represented by Brooke, whom you just met, and the White House Historical Association, represented by Frederick Ryan Jr., whose beautiful and delightful book we are discussing this evening. We will dive deep into a conversation in a moment, but first, I want those of you who've tuned in to know that you will have the opportunity to put questions to our presenters this evening using the Zoom toolbar to do so. As Claire said, I think we've all been looking forward to this evening's program because how often do you have the chance to explore the fascinating intersection where wine and power meet? Not wine in the sense of WHINE, because there's been plenty of that lately, but the good stuff that comes from grapes. It's a great topic to plumb, but it hasn't gotten that much attention until Fred Ryan came along. Frederick Ryan is publisher and CEO of the Washington Post. And more to the point this evening, he has been an aficionado of wines most of his life, no doubt because of his upbringing in Italy and California. At the same time, Fred has also had a lifelong fascination with the American presidency. He served in a senior staff position in the Reagan White House, was Reagan's post-presidential chief of staff. Fred is also the editor of 2 books on Reagan, one dealing with the Gipper's humor and the other dealing with his genius for communication. A detailed biography of Fred's storied career can be found at the Gerald R. Ford Foundation website. Welcome, Fred.
Thank you, Cleves. It's great to be with you, and it's great to have the chance to talk to Friends of Ford. What a great group that supports the important work of the Presidential Foundation for our 38th president. So I'm really honored to be able to be with you.
Oh, thanks a lot. Well, in some ways, wine and power are the oldest combinations since the beginning of history. You point this out on page 1 of your book. What gave you the idea to boil such a rich topic, of such a historic topic, boil it down and write Wine in the White House?
Well, as you mentioned, Cleves, wine has been a central element of the human experience as long as history's been recorded. We read in the Bible about after the flood. What did Noah do? He planted vineyards. Greek mythology talks about the wine. In Roman days, wine was a very essential element in all of the Roman feasts. And in fact, there's a saying by Pliny the Elder, one of the Roman philosophers, in vino veritas, meaning in wine is truth. And that's something we hear a lot today. But there had, over the years, many books have been written about presidents and about other aspects of the White House, about the music in the White House and the furniture and the art and other things in the White House. But there's never been a book written about wine in the White House. And being interested, as you mentioned, in presidential history and also having an interest in wine, it was just a chance to write a book about an intersection of those two interests.
Well, it's always fascinating to learn how a busy person finds the time to write a book. Given your work with the Washington Post, the Reagan Foundation, and as a media executive in the nation's capital, how did you ever find the time to write a 450-page book?
Well, Gleaves, it didn't start off to be a 450-page book. Since nothing had been written in this area, I started doing some original research and had a great team that worked with me. And we just, and as a historian, I'm sure this is an experience you've had many times, you just keep finding more. And it's more interesting. And we had original access to documents that hadn't been published before. We went to original sources and just kept learning more and more and discovered there were more dimensions to it than I originally thought. So I wasn't planning on doing a book that was 450 pages. It weighs 5.5 pounds, as you know. But when you get into it, I broke it down. One whole section is about the presidents and their experiences with wine, president by president, and what they did. Another, which evolved over time, was what wines were we drinking as Americans? What wines were our presidents serving? And that changed quite a bit. And then the question everyone asked, well, how are the wines selected for the White House and how are they stored? Who advises the presidents? So that became a chapter. And then I found that particularly early in our history, presidents were making big statements with very fancy glassware, with decanters and glasses, showing that America had arrived. So there's a whole chapter on the glassware. And then, people love to look at White House menus and see how the foods and wines were paired. So we added a chapter on the menus, and you can go back and you can recreate a White House dinner and look at the wine, maybe from a more recent vintage. And then finally, a lot of wines have been served at the White House over the years. So we did a comprehensive list. It includes every wine served at any official event since 1953. So historians and wine aficionados and people who are just curious can look in there and find every wine that was served by every president since that time.
And I'm just curious, historian to historian, what surprised you the most when you were researching the book?
Well, I'll tell you, one thing that surprised me at the beginning was how much wine presidents were drinking and how much they were serving and how much they were paying for it. I found out that Thomas Jefferson, in today's dollars, was spending about $70,000 a year just for wine. You fast forward to President Buchanan. He spent $88,000 a year for wine. I found records for a dinner President Ulysses S. Grant had, where they spent on champagne alone at one dinner the equivalent of $30,000 in today's money. So that's one thing that surprised me. Wine was very central to the presidents. They spent a lot of time in some presidents' cases selecting the wine, and they served a lot of it as well.
Fascinating. Well, now let's bring our second expert presenter onto our Zoom stage. Adam Fortuna is a Grand Rapids, Michigan sommelier, or where I come from, we'd call him a wine expert. He honed his craft in a number of places, including Seattle, where he was voted Seattle's best and one of America's top bartenders. So Adam brings to us great knowledge of his craft, and a more detailed biography of his accomplishments can be found at the foundation website. For those of you tasting at home with us tonight, Adam is going to help us get the party started with a beverage typically reserved for celebrations, but there were presidents who enjoyed it on a daily basis, as Fred just said, and who could blame them? Well, Adam, the floor is yours. Please tell us about our first wine selection.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. Thank you to Gerald Ford for having me. I wish I had the $30,000 budget dinner that the president had to serve us wine tonight. But given the confines of what we're working with, we have three really great wines, like everybody said. Please have them open as we go forward. The first one we're starting with, I'm going to hold it up and show everybody, is a sparkling wine. This is called Champollion Brut Vouvray. So we wanted to, presidents, as we just discussed, had pretty expensive taste. but trying to get this all into a package where we could open it at home and feel good drinking about it. We picked a sparkling wine that is very similar to Champagne, but it's actually made outside of the actual region in Champagne, France. As you'll see in Fred's book, in the early years of the in the early presidencies, French wine kind of dominated what they were drinking, what they were buying, and what was considered the most prestigious region in the world, and perhaps still is. And that's due to many reasons. One, the United States has really only been making wine or quality wine for about 100 years, maybe a little bit longer. So there wasn't many options to choose from, and France has kind of always been at the forefront in the wine world. So this wine that we're drinking, like I said, it's in the Champagne style. It's from a grape called Chenin Blanc, which is very, very prevalent in the Loire Valley where this wine is from. And they're doing the exact same process that you would do in Champagne. But because it's not actually in that region, it commands about a third of the price, which is great for all of us. The one interesting fact about this wine is you see on the back of it, for those of you at home, it's imported by a gentleman named Kermit Lynch. On the back of all of his bottles, I'm going to zoom it way in, he has a quote from Thomas Jefferson. So I kind of thought that was fitting. It says, "Good wine is a necessity of life for me," and that was apparent given those the numbers that you quoted that Thomas Jefferson was spending per year. So what you're gonna notice in this wine is that it's bone dry. It has really fine bubbles, creating a really nice mouthfeel, really fresh acidity, bright fruit flavors. And it's actually certified organic and sustainably farmed, which is always something that's nice to drink. I'm willing to poison myself a bit with alcohol. Why would I include all the additives if I don't have to? And it's also from a husband and wife team who have now included their daughter. So we're really drinking this wine. You're really supporting kind of a family versus some huge conglomerate, if you will. So with that being said, I cheers everybody, and I hope you enjoy the wines. Like they said, there's going to be a Q&A after, and I'm happy to answer any questions as we move forward. And I'll send it back to you, gentlemen.
Well, thank you very much, Adam. And now let's bring Fred back into the conversation. Let's talk about some specific presidents, Fred. You say that 3 presidents in particular were the most knowledgeable about wine. Tell us who they are.
Yes, I found that there were 3, many presidents had interest in wine and consumed it, but there were 3 that really seemed to have deep knowledge and a passion about it. One was President Nixon, which surprised me because him having come from a Quaker background and a very simple life, but he became very sophisticated and knowledgeable about the wines of Europe, particularly Germany and France. And when he served wines at the White House for events, he would spend personal time selecting those wines. And there were some funny stories I'd be happy to share with you that I know you may be aware of Gleaves with his wine service, but he was very knowledgeable. Second one was Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan had an interest in wines, both American and international, but you remember he was governor of California at the time that the California wine industry was really coming of age. And he played a big part of that. And when he came to the White House, he made sure that great wines, particularly California wines, were served. But the one standout above and beyond any others was Thomas Jefferson. I think Thomas Jefferson could rightly be called the founding father of American wine. While he was our emissary over in Paris, he traveled throughout the wine country of France and Italy, Germany. He took extensive notes. He ranked the wines. When he came back to the United States, he brought that knowledge with him. He designed the first White House wine cellar, and he even kept a log of every single wine that was served the time that he was president in the White House. And I came across that log and I've included it in the book. But the one thing that with Thomas Jefferson that really got me was I found a letter on the desk of a winemaker over in Bordeaux today, at a very well-known winemaker called Chateau Yquem, one of the great wines of the world. And it's been in business for over 250 years. Well, sitting on this winemaker's desk is this original letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote in 1790 to the owner of the chateau saying, our new president, General Washington, has an interest in wine, and I think he would enjoy yours. So please send him 30 dozen bottles. And while you're at it, send me 10 dozen bottles as well.
Wow, that's amazing. I am curious, how does Thomas Jefferson's list, he makes these lists of wine. How does his evaluation of the vineyards and the grapes stand up today?
He was remarkably ahead of his time because in France in 1855, Napoleon was having the equivalent of, I guess you could call it the International Exposition, the World's Fair, and that was taking place in France. And Napoleon established a commission to rank in 1855 the top wines in France by category in 5 different categories. And from the first, they called the premier cru, the top, all the way to the 5th cru. And that standard still holds today. Well, I found that Thomas Jefferson, 75 years earlier, basically toured France, and he made his own list of what he thought the top wines in France were. And it was remarkably similar, his own list, to the list that this committee put together in the middle of the next century.
That's phenomenal. Well, I mean, he's the man of the Enlightenment. He's using reason and deep analysis. And so it's good to see that those skills came to play and bore fruit even in the wine. Well, go ahead, Fred.
No, I was just going to say in the wine cellar, which was interesting, when the White House was built, there was no President Adams, as you know, lived in as the White House was being completed. President Adams was there, and Thomas Jefferson moved in after him as the 3rd president, and the White House wasn't quite complete. There were rooms they were still doing construction on, but the one thing he noticed, there was no wine cellar. So he designed the wine cellar, and he built it right under the north portico of the White House, right in front where you see the columns. And he built an identical version out at Monticello, his home. And that version is still in place today. So people can see what the original White House wine cellar looked like if they go to Monticello or if they go to the website for Monticello.
But the original wine cellar in the White House that Jefferson designed does not survive?
No, what happened, actually interesting story, in 1814, as you know, when the British burned the White House in the War of 1812, they burned it to the ground. And we all learn in school about Dolly Madison and that famous story where she said, "Save the George Washington portrait." And that was taken out and it was saved from the fire. Well, I was wondering, Thomas Jefferson had just been president. There was a lot of wine in that White House, and it was a wine cellar. What happened to the wine? And did some research and found that the British burned the White House, and then they left to burn other buildings. And the American soldiers arrived, and they discovered here was the burned White House, but there was this big wine cellar underneath. So the American soldiers drank the wine that was in the White House that the British had left.
Oh, that's a riot. Well, let's bring the expertise about wine up to the present. How would you rate President Trump and President-elect Biden when it comes to wine? I mean, the former doesn't even drink alcohol, is my understanding, and yet he knows his wines. What can you say about them?
Well, when you factor in Biden as president-elect, interestingly, it will mean 3 of the last 4 presidents have been non-drinkers. President Bush was non-drinker. President Obama did drink, and of course, President Trump and President-elect Biden do not. But that's never really stopped the wine service because wine has become such an important part of our official ceremonies, our diplomatic events, that as the events are planned and state dinners are put together and other official events, just as time is given to planning the right food and the right entertainment and the right guests, extensive work is given in planning the right wine. Mrs. Bush, of course, spent a lot of time selecting wines, even though President Bush was a non-drinker. And President and Trump, incidentally, is the only president to own a commercial winery. He doesn't drink, but he owns a winery out in Virginia. And then, and President-elect Biden, he, over his many years of government service, has done his share of ceremonial toasts and making sure that guests are well entertained. So I have no doubt that the wine service at the White House will continue to be an important part of entertaining.
Well, at this point, we're going to invite our sommelier, Adam, back to our screen. As we learned from reading the book, many of our former presidents had an affinity for French wine, and Adam has a nice red blend for us to try. Adam, please teach us about our second wine selection for the evening.
So this next wine that we're drinking is the Chateau La Ribot. It's this bottle right there for those of you drinking at home. And as Fred mentioned, there was this big classification in 1855 that, like you said, was basically, let's rate the best wines in all of France. and it still holds true to this day. And to get some of those that were, there were 5 chateaus that were ranked in that first tier. And to get those today, I mean, you're talking about, I'm not joking, minimum $1,000 a bottle when they come out. And then as they age, they go up and up and up. And to kind of put that into perspective is how much Bordeaux has become a collector's region. I was gifted a bottle of 1980 Chateau Mouton, which is a first growth, which is a really respected house. And it still had the sticker on it from when it was purchased in 1983. And at that time it was $43. And now to get a bottle of that, it's easily over $1,000 if you can even get your hands on it. So beyond those first 5 classifications that Fred mentioned, the next one after that was called Cru Bourgeois. And that's actually what we're drinking now, which meant it didn't make those top 5 tiers of houses, but it was kind of a collection of a bunch of other great chateaus that were making delicious wine in Bordeaux. So Chateau Ribaud is, it's mostly actually Merlot, and then it's blended with a little bit of Cabernet and a few other grapes. And it's, Bordeaux is really important because it's kind of the reason that Americans or American wine started with Cabernet and Merlot, and you see these grapes that are so prevalent now. This is all due to the region of Bordeaux. There were clippings taken from them that were then planted in California, and then eventually, 25, 30, 40 years later, some of the California wines started beating Bordeaux in terms of quality and in terms of these rankings. So it's really interesting to see, to compare the two. So what you generally get out of Bordeaux versus American Merlot or Cabernet is the wines are going to be significantly drier. They don't have as much oaky flavors to them. They're not as sweet. They definitely have a lot of tannin, which is what dries your mouth out and makes it really delicious with food. So that makes perfect sense as why you would want to serve that in state dinners or any sort of celebratory occasion. And again, as much as we want to serve you the first growth wines, I think we'll save that for another another time we do one of those chats and we have a sponsorship or something. But this is a really classic example of Southwestern French wine coming out of Bordeaux. And I think it's tasting super delicious tonight. So.
Thank you, Adam. You bet it's tasting delicious tonight. You have such a great knowledge, a reservoir of knowledge for these wines. It's fascinating to behold.
Thank you.
Well, now let's bring Fred back into our conversation. As you point out, Fred, wine has actually played a role in shaping our nation's history. Indeed, the White House has borne witness to America's darkest moments as well as to our greatest triumphs. On every major step, from inaugural celebrations to a quiet private dinner to world-changing diplomatic events, arguably the one constant has been wine. Now, of all the events you've studied and gathered in your book, what, in your opinion, were some of the most memorable occasions or discussions over wine at the White House? In other words, when was history made over wine?
Well, I think there were many occasions, and Gleaves, if I could just follow up on the great point that Adam made, which there was an evolution in the wines that were served at the White House. When George Washington was president, and even before, the primary wine in America was Madeira. It was a wine from an island off the coast of Portugal that was made from, it was a fortified wine, and it was very hardy, and you could put it in the bow of a ship and it could take the rough ride on the seas, it could take the heat and would arrive in the United States, and it would be maybe even better than when it left. And that was the wine, the only wine that could survive the journey. Thomas Jefferson, when he was in France, as we were talking about a little earlier, discovered these great wineries and also worked on the logistics of getting the wines over. So that moved American wines from this Madeira to the wines of Bordeaux, and as Adam mentioned, which it was for many years, up until really the 20th century is when the wines kind of moved to California and then to broader American wines. And now it's exclusively American wines. But to your question, there were a number of times where wine was central to historical moments. One that comes to mind is back to Richard Nixon. When Nixon went to China, that famous opening, he carefully thought about what wine he should bring. And he brought a bottle of, as we're enjoying right now, sparkling wine. It was a California sparkling wine called Schramsberg. And there's a lot of history behind that. He brought a 1969 vintage and used it to toast the opening of China with the Chinese officials. But the interesting history on that wine goes back and it goes forward. It goes back to the end of the 19th century. President Harrison went out to California and visited the wine country. And the first place he visited was a place called Schramsberg. It was just making wine. So you have all the way back to our 23rd president making the first visit. You have Nixon then serving it, 37th president serving it at the diplomatic event. And it is the most frequently served sparkling wine at the White House today. It's been served by every president, including President Ford, up into the present to end the meal. So that champagne has kind of run the course. But that was a diplomatic moment. Another interesting one with wine I learned about was Kennedy. He had, as you remember, in 1961, he went to Vienna for this summit, this high stakes summit with the Soviet leader. He didn't, he was the young, Khrushchev was the established heavy player, and Kennedy was this young new president. And they do a reciprocal dinner. So they would meet, and there would be a dinner at the Soviet embassy and then a dinner at the American embassy. Well, Khrushchev showed up with lots of vodka and some Georgian wines, and that was his entertainment. Kennedy did not want to take anything to chance, so he brought a 1953 Chateau Mouton Rothschild, the wine that Adam just mentioned is one of the rarest in the world. He brought wine, bottles of that to be served at his reciprocal dinner. So you could debate what happened at the summit itself, but in terms of the battle over the wines, Kennedy won.
That's great, because Kennedy got pretty beat up in that summit. Even his brother, Bobby, they went back to the hotel room after one of the meetings and said, "You have got to stand up to this guy. He's just bullying you." So I'm glad the wine apparently helped.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk just a little bit about the ladies. As Abigail Adams said, let us not forget the ladies. And what about the role of the first ladies and wine? You know, must start with Dolly Madison, you've already mentioned, but other first ladies have been really astute.
Yes, the first ladies have played a very important role in the service, and I should also say the non-service of wine at the White House. One that particularly stands out is Lucy Hayes, the wife of Rutherford B. Hayes, our 19th president. And as you know, Prohibition took place in the United States from 1920 to 1933. But before that, there was a movement called the temperance movement. And that was a political movement designed to discourage the consumption of alcohol. And Lucy Hayes, Rutherford B. Hayes' wife, was very active in the temperance movement. So he becomes president, and they have a very important state dinner that's taking place. It was the son of the Russian Tsar. And at that time, that was a very, very important relationship to us. So the diplomatic leadership came in and said, we must serve wine. It's part of every diplomatic event. It's central that wine be served. And she didn't want to serve it, but she finally reneged in the end, and she allowed the wine to be served at this dinner for the son of the Tsar. It was the only time during that entire administration that wine was served in the White House. And in fact, as I mentioned earlier, there were so many beautiful pieces of glassware that previous presidents had purchased going all the way back to George Washington. She would use that glassware to serve fruit juice. So she was given the name at the time, Lemonade Lucy, because of her restriction on wine and serving fruit juice. If you fast forward, I would say another first lady who played an important role was Eleanor Roosevelt. You remember then, Prohibition had just ended, and wines had not been served at the White House. And she issued an edict. She said, wine service at the White House should be domestic wines, and it should be limited. None of these big meals like some presidents before, where there'd be 8 different wines and 13 toasts and all. And the problem, though, was at that time, the American wine industry had just come out of Prohibition, and it was in really sad shape. And there weren't very many great wines. I found that the diary of the Secretary of the Interior to FDR, Harold Ickes, and his diary described the dinner at the White House. And he said, those wines that Mrs. Roosevelt made us drink were terrible, and the champagne was undrinkable. So that was kind of her impact. If you fast forward, I would come next maybe to Jacqueline Kennedy. Jacqueline Kennedy was very focused with everything French and elegance and the highest quality. And during the Kennedy administration, the finest wines in the world were served. The first growths that Adam described were the regular wines to be served at state dinners at the White House, the best wines that you could find in the world at that time. So she played that role. And then I would just say maybe more recently, Michelle Obama. Michelle Obama does have an interest in wine, and she would even have events where she would have her girlfriends over for a little wine tasting. And she went out to the Virginia countryside where there's some great wineries, and would with her friends and would try those out. In fact, served the first Virginia wine to be served at the White House during one of their state dinners.
Oh, that's fascinating. And I think your mention of Eleanor Roosevelt insisting on domestic wines makes me think of President Gerald R. Ford, who also insisted on domestic wines during his administration. Now I've got I'm sorry, were you going to?
No, I was just going to say he did. And when he first came into office, his first couple of state dinners had already been planned during the Nixon administration. So they favored French wines because Nixon was very much an aficionado of French wines. But as soon as the dinners that President Ford began planning took place, it was American wines, and he was a champion of American wines. And in fact, served the first Michigan-made wine ever at the White House from Mount Tabor Vineyards. And it was another Michigan wine was not served for 40 years until President Obama was in office, and he served a Michigan ice wine.
Very good. That would be a very sweet wine.
Yes.
Well, gosh, you've done so much research on these events and White House dinner parties, that kind of thing. I got to just ask you, after doing all this research, personally, which dinner party do you wish you had been a guest at, and why?
I would say a couple come to mind. One of them actually was a state visit that President Ford hosted. President Ford hosted the Queen of England for our July 4th, 1776 bicentennial. And as you know, when there's a state dinner, a lot of work goes into planning it. That dinner may last 3 or 4 hours, but there will be weeks and months of planning. Every detail, from the china that's used, from the decor, the flowers, the music, the entertainment, the wines, the food. So that's what state dinners are important. And when it's a royal state dinner, that's high stakes. And the Queen coming for the bicentennial, that is about the highest stakes it could be. So President Ford did, by the way, he served 2 great wines. One of them was a Chenin Blanc. Adam described the first wine we're having tonight was made from those grapes in France. This was an American Chenin Blanc. And then he served one of the great American Cabernet Sauvignons of the day, Beaulieu Vineyards. But that would have been quite an evening. The other one that comes to mind to me would be maybe when Kennedy was president, because they were doing so many events where they had the artists and the musicians, and it would have just been a very interesting crowd to be able to be around.
And I've got to ask you this, you know, writers always have that frustrating time when they're trying to edit the book down and something really juicy, something wonderful ends up on the cutting room floor that you hope could have been included in the book. Is there a story you would like to tell us, or a wine you would like to mention that ended up on the cutting room floor?
Well, since the book is 456 pages, I was not too disciplined about putting things on the cutting room floor. I did find, as you'll see through the book, when I did this, in all seriousness, since there hadn't been another book on the subject, I wanted to make it as comprehensive as possible. And in fact, to be the definitive piece, at least for a while, on this subject. But I didn't want it to be boring, and I wanted it to be fun. So as you notice, when you go, every other page has a little quote or a joke or an anecdote about a president, usually a president speaking about wine or a world leader speaking about wine. And I had so many of those, I had to stop. So I put the best ones in, and they're on almost every page. And there were some great ones that I had a favorite. If I could share, one of my favorites was Winston Churchill, not an American president, but somebody who was known to consume his beverages. And I found the records from when he was at the White House first, that the ushers had for serving him his meals. And it said sherry, champagne, brandy, and wine at all 3 meals. But the quote that I found that I put in the book that I thought was just classic Churchill, as you know, wine comes in different sized bottles. You have the regular bottle and you have the Magnum, which is twice the size of a regular bottle, and it goes up from there. Well, the Churchill quote was, "A magnum of wine is the perfect size for 2 gentlemen having lunch, especially if one is not drinking."
Oh gosh, the one and only Sir Winston Churchill. Thank you for that great story. Well, let's switch it up again. For those of you sipping along at home, we welcome back our sommelier to the screen. For this third and final wine of the evening, Adam is going to walk us through one of the most popular grapes in the United States today. Welcome back, Adam.
Thank you. Winston Churchill sounds like my kind of guy. I mean, I'd love to have lunch with him sometime. I hope you all enjoyed the first two wines, and we're kind of segueing into the third wine, which is going to be a Cabernet Sauvignon from Clos de Napa and Napa Valley. This has become easily, in my opinion, probably the most important grape varietal in the United States, perhaps the world. It's definitely one of the most popular. That being said, looking through Fred's book and seeing the kind of wines, again, third time's a charm, but seeing the kind of wines they served, Inglenook and some of these really prestigious Napa houses that have just skyrocketed in price from the time that when they were serving them, well, we decided to pick, I wanted to pick one that I thought was very indicative of what the Napa Valley is, but also, again, didn't break the budget, something that you could have every single day. Or maybe every weekend. For me, every day. For you guys, every weekend. After tasting the second one and moving on to this one, you'll notice that this has got a significant increase in body. It's a lot more full. It has a ton of oakiness to it. It's got really, really rich fruit flavors. And it makes sense that, the presidents weren't serving this until the mid 20th century. They weren't really interested in American wines because it takes kind of a long time for a region to gain its footing. I often get asked, what do you think of Michigan wine? And Michigan wine being such a young wine region, I think that in 20 years, it's going to be amazing, but it's kind of just like planting an apple tree. You don't expect the fruit of an apple tree to be great in the first couple of years. It takes time for it to gain its footing and for the grapes to produce something of high quality. So after about 50 or 60 years, Napa really came into its own and starting to produce world-class wines. And to this day, they just are absolute showstoppers. They're extremely opulent. They have dark fruit flavors, tons of richness. They're kind of a perfect celebratory wine. I mean, it's a perfect Christmas wine. And I think this one's drinking amazingly right now. So,
thanks so much for sharing your expertise, Adam. I'm learning a whole lot about wines, and I'm going to have to dedicate part of my budget to trying some of these that you're talking about. And Fred, of course, you're no slouch when it comes to wines. You've been fortunate to develop friendships with winemakers around the globe and to be a principal in a joint winemaking venture in Napa Valley. You have an overview few of us have. So here's my question. If you were to plan a dinner party at the White House, what wine would you most like to serve? What would you pair it with? And which president would it be with?
Wow, those are three really big challenges. I mean, I think the president part, I could knock that one down first. Thomas Jefferson, just because of his place in history, but also interest in wine. If I could pick a wine, it would be exactly of the variety that Adam described, California Cabernet. I think it's what America is just doing extremely well. And the food, that's a tough one. I would rather double down on the wine and maybe not go quite as heavy on the food. But obviously I have an American, what the White House does now at state dinners is they showcase great American cuisine. And as much of the wine, the ultimate opportunity to showcase great things about America is in America's house, in the White House. So that's why the wines are so carefully chosen, and the foods are carefully selected. But I would just mention, as Adam was talking about California wines, if I could talk a little bit about the evolution of that, because it went, as we talked about earlier, from all French to now essentially primarily Californian, but all throughout America. But I did some research and found the first time I could find any record of California wine at the White House. It goes all the way back to Abraham Lincoln. And a guy who he'd appointed to be the commissioner of the port of San Francisco was so happy to get the appointment that here he was out in California, and he discovered they were making wine there. So in 1864, he sent Abraham Lincoln a case of 1859 California wine. I couldn't find any record if it was served or drank. And in fact, Lincoln was known to be very, very light in his drinking. And the chief usher in the White House would say that during ceremonial toasts, Abraham Lincoln would raise the glass to his lip, but he could never tell if he was letting any of the alcohol touch his tongue. But that was the first case. And then as we talked earlier about Eleanor Roosevelt and American wines, but they started during Eisenhower. If you look back just before Eisenhower, at the end of World War II, you had a country where our own wine business was basically shut down because of the effects of prohibition and then the war. We had really no wine being imported because of the war itself. So America became kind of a cocktail nation. Our beverage of choice became cocktails. And that was kind of through Truman and then Eisenhower, and he began serving a little more wine and served California wines on occasion at the White House, maybe more of a novelty. If it was an event that really wasn't too important, they would serve a California wine. But they began to make progress. Then President Kennedy, as we talked about, shifted to exclusively French. And wine, by the way, at that time, all wine was kind of coming back. It was becoming a social phenomenon, and pop culture was in some ways aligning with wine. And one story I share in the book was President Kennedy was a fan of the Ian Fleming James Bond novels and movies. And to show you how pop culture can affect our leadership, our government, in 1962, the James Bond movie came out called Dr. No. And you may recall in that movie, there was a scene where James Bond, Sean Connery, picks up a bottle of champagne and he's going to use it to defend himself against a guard. And Dr. No calmly says, "That's a Dom Perignon 55. It would be a pity to break it." James Bond sits it back down. 2 months later, at the Kennedy White House, on the state dinner menu, the champagne chosen was a Dom Perignon 1955. And to even take it a step further, he was such a fan, Kennedy, of the James Bond films that he was given a special private showing of the next James Bond film that came after that, From Russia with Love. And it was shown at the White House on November 20th, 1963, 2 days before he was assassinated. It was the last film he saw. But Kennedy was focused on French. LBJ comes in, and there's this group called the Wine Institute in Washington that's promoting American wines and California wines. And they start sending truckfuls of California wine to the White House, and LBJ serves that. Nixon then comes in with his French preference, a little bit more French, but still some California. And then after that, with President Ford, it was American wines all the way up until today. And there's really nothing. In fact, during the Reagan administration, there was a bit of an embarrassing incident where there were wines in the White House that had been purchased by President Nixon that were meant to age for his successors to sell. And these were great French wines, some of the finest wines in the world, but they were bought to age. And Reagan's there, wants to serve California wines, but also sees these wines in the cellar they're not going to be any good if they're not served pretty soon. So there was one event at the White House where he'd invited regional reporters from across the country, TV anchors and editors there was a way to kind of go over the national press and go out to all the local press. He invited a whole group into the White House for a day of briefings and updates on issues. And he spoke to them and his cabinet spoke to them. Well, at lunch, somebody made the mistake of saying, we've got these French wines in the cellar. Let's get rid of some of that. Let's serve it to this lunch to these reporters. Well, the only story that came out of the full day, forget the issues, forget the discussions, the briefings, it was Reagan serves French wine at White House. So since then, it's been exclusively American wines.
Fascinating. I bet everybody at dinner parties wants to sit next to you.
No.
Or as you have. Well, I think Claire is going to come back to the party now. And I think Claire's appearance on the screen is going to be the cue that it's time to open our discussion up to our audience and give them the chance now to put questions to Fred and Adam. Claire, take it away.
Hello, absolutely. This is such a ball. We've got quite a few questions, so we probably won't be able to get to all of them, but hey, we're going to do our best. Fred, you had mentioned prohibition. Larry from Grand Rapids wants to know, was wine secretly served at the White House during the Prohibition era?
Larry asks a good question. as you know, what happened with Prohibition, it actually occurred during Woodrow Wilson's presidency. The 18th Amendment was passed. And the Congress passed a law called the Volstead Act, and its purpose was to implement the 18th Amendment. Well, Woodrow Wilson was not in favor of banning alcohol, so he vetoed it. And then Congress overrode his veto. So then we were in Prohibition. And one just other thing I'd mention on Woodrow Wilson is during Prohibition, you could drink wine technically. What you couldn't do is buy it, sell it, or transport it. And Woodrow Wilson had this wine cellar that he'd accumulated in the White House. And when he left, it was still Prohibition. He left in 1921. And he had to get special regulatory approval for him to take his wine out of the White House and transport it to a house he'd purchased in Washington just a few miles away. It required a legislation for him to be able to do that. But the question Larry asked about, was wine served? Yes, I mean, the country was dry, but the White House was anything but dry, particularly during the Harding administration. Harding was known to have cocktail parties twice a week, poker nights. He would go to the Chevy Chase Club where he was observed having a bottle of whiskey in his golf bag. And there were even rumors that while alcohol was illegal and was being seized by the Justice Department, that wine and alcohol was being delivered to the White House for Harding to serve to his guests. So Harding was pretty loose in terms of abiding by Prohibition. And then, Hoover, the next president, went, I read a story about him being at a sporting event. He went to throw out the ball, the opening game of the World Series. And instead of people cheering, the crowd started, for him, they started cheering, "We want beer, we want beer." So that was kind of the beginning of the end of Prohibition. And Franklin Roosevelt was the president when Prohibition ended. He signed the law ending Prohibition. And the first thing he said afterwards was, "Now sounds like a good time for a beer."
Well, great question and an even better answer. Okay, our next question is for Adam from Christy. Christy is curious to know how global warming is impacting the wine industry, especially in California and in France.
Well, I mean, that's like quite the political question, I would say. No, I think that, regardless of what you believe, yeah, I mean, the wine world is shifting. The fires that have happened in California, I mean, that started really pretty heavily in 2017 in wine country, up until most recently this year was just, catastrophic. There's one really, really prevalent winemaker in Napa who I just heard everything from his 2020 crop. He ended up selling 85% of it and he won't be bottling it because he didn't think it was up to par. And what you're going to see with that, particularly with fires, is that grapes are really permeable, meaning flavors and scents and all of these things get through the skins really easily. So if your vineyards are just laden with smoke for an extended period of time, the wine is going to taste smoky. As far as France goes and other regions, I know a lot of vineyards, and so we tasted a sparkling wine first, which was very reminiscent of Champagne. And Champagne is actually one of the coldest wine growing regions in the world. And that's how Champagne retains this really bright acidity, this freshness. And I know a lot of Champagne growers are looking further north, outside of France, to plant new vineyards, to kind of prepare for things to come. So I think it's gonna, as of right now, it's actually making wine better. Unfortunately, this is not me trying to pitch anything positive towards global warming, but warm climates help grapes grow. So right now, wines are better than they've ever been. But, in a few years, some of these vineyards are going to be non-existent. In regions that are normally colder regions like Canada, northern Michigan, even parts of like northern Germany, you're going to start seeing more higher quality wines coming out of there and lesser quality wines from France and California, et cetera.
And Adam, just briefly, a couple of people asked, could you please recap the names of the 3 wines that you selected for the evening? I'll let our viewers know too, if you are a Facebook user, on our Facebook page, Gerald R. Ford Foundation Facebook page, we did post earlier this week the names of those wines and the pictures of them. But Adam, if you wouldn't mind just giving us a quick recap of those, a couple of people are asking.
Yeah, totally. So if you're in the Grand Rapids area, all of these are available at Rishi's International Beverage. That's where all of you guys got your tasting kits. So thank you to him for, allowing that to happen. So I'll quickly do a flash of the label and also tell you. So this is Champalou, Brut Vouvray, which is Chenin Blanc from the Loire Valley in France. I don't want to, take too long to say these, but Chateau La Ribot, which is a Bordeaux from the western bank of Bordeaux. And then Clos de Napa, which is sorry, I'm trying to get my lighting right so you can actually see it. Clos de Napa, which is a Napa Cabernet. And just to also let people know, these weren't wines that were actually served in the White House. We were just trying to figure out things that were extremely comparable to the wines that they would serve. So we picked the first one to be comparable to Champagne. The second one's very reminiscent of the plethora of Bordeaux and French reds that were served, and then a very classic Napa Cabernet for the third one.
Excellent. Thank you, Adam. Next question is for Fred. Alex wants to know, when Thomas Jefferson was exploring France and making his extensive list, what was his number one wine on that list?
Well, he made multiple lists and he organized them by region. I don't think he had a number one favorite from all that he had, but he ranked in Bordeaux, the area that Adam was talking about earlier, a wine called Chateau Margaux, which is still in existence today. And it's another one of the ones that, as Adam mentioned, costs about $1,000 a bottle if you can get it. But it was great then, and it is great now. And it's a wine that's been served at the White House over the years. In fact, there's a story about President Nixon that maybe I could share on this. I'd heard this report, and he was, as I said earlier, quite a wine aficionado. He knew his wines. And there have been these rumors I'd heard for years that he would pick one very nice wine for his guests at an event, and that he would have a separate wine, an even better one, that a wine steward would hold over by the table with a cloth around it so you couldn't see the label. And this was, some people argued that it was true and others denied it. Well, I did some research and found actually no source other than Woodward and Bernstein, investigative reporters, confirmed in their book, The Final Days, about Nixon, that he did in fact have a separate wine that was served just to him and a different wine for his guests. And the expression that's been used has been called pulling a Nixon. And the wine that he had, I mean, talk about the historical links. His favorite wine that he would have was a 1966 Chateau Margaux, the same wine that more than a century earlier, Thomas Jefferson had chosen as his favorite wine.
Pulling a Nixon. Wow. I can't wait to use that on a friend. Okay. Marge would like to know, Fred, could you relay to us a funny or unusual event, I suppose, surrounding wine at a White House gathering? Is there kind of a funny story or something really unusual surrounding wine that had happened?
Yeah, there were actually several funny things. Sometimes the presidents would get funny with their toasts. And toasts, by the way, I could talk a little about that because I learned an awful lot of eye-opening things about toast, but I'll answer a question first. Sometimes presidents be funny. One of them I thought was pretty funny with President Clinton. He had the Prime Minister of England there, and he was making his toast and paraphrasing, back to James Bond, the James Bond line. He said, "May our relationships between our countries always be strong, never shaken and never stirred." So that was kind of use of humor. And then there were the rules on toasts have evolved. There was a toast that Carter did in 1979. He was in Mexico City. President Lopez Portillo, he was hosting a reciprocal lunch. And instead of standing up and doing a gracious toast, President Portillo stood up and started making a very negative statement about the United States and what we were doing and its impact on the world, and went on and on with this very negative statement. And Carter got up and responded with an equally negative statement, including everything about how Americans get Montezuma's revenge when they go to Mexico. And it was viewed as the exchange of insults rather than the exchange of toasts. But if I could, just on toast, because it's very interesting, there's a whole chapter on the book on this. I learned a lot about toast. Toasting goes back to the earliest days of history. In fact, in Rome, they would have large banquets, and each guest would pass a large vessel of wine. They would take a sip and they would pass it to the person next to them, and they would wish them good health. And it would go all the way around the room. Well, at that time, the wine was pretty bad, and the wine in these vessels was awful. So they would take a piece of bread and they would literally toast it. They would burn it and they would drop it into the vessel, and it would absorb the impurities of the wine. And that's where the term toast first came from. I also learned, it even gets worse than that, in the Scottish Highlands during around the 10th century or so, after warring factions would fight, the victorious warriors would come back and they would drink out of the skulls of the opponents who they'd slayed. And when you hear someone use the expression skull when you're doing a toast, that's where it got its origin. But it's they've evolved today to be much more civilized. The Americans actually, in our early days of our country, would do 13 different toasts at our state functions in honor of the 13 different colonies. That's been kind of adjusted today to a single toast is done. And actually, one other interesting toast fact about that is the toast used to always be at the end of the evening, and they're kept to 2 or 3 minutes. And President Carter, with a state visit at the beginning of the evening, before the wine was even served, he got up and he went to the podium with his water glass and he just made a toast without thinking about the timing. And he went and sat down and he realized that the wine hadn't been served yet. So they reserved the wine and he went back up and he made the toast again to make it formal with a wine glass with wine in it. And he, and then every president since then, has followed that example of doing the toast at the beginning of the evening. And the reason is the presidents just don't want to have to think about it all evening. They want to enjoy themselves.
Absolutely. I'm sure a lot of us watching have had the pressure of having to give a toast and know what that feels like. Fred, would you say that there's any certain presidents who are the best toast givers?
I would say now the toasts have been, they're pre-written in advance. They're meant to pay tribute to our guests. I think I would say, well, Kennedy and Reagan both would add a little element of humor or add a little spontaneous story. So they certainly made those interesting toasts.
Great. Okay, next question is for Adam. Adam, what are your best tips about chilling wine, or I guess serving wine? How should we care for it? How should we chill our wines?
I mean, I think first and foremost, you should, whatever you think is the right way is the right way. No one should tell you how to drink your wine. I mean, I generally think that we drink white wine a little too cold and we drink red wine a little too warm. There's some tricks to get your white wine cold or your sparkling wine cold in a flash. And one of them that I use often when I'm not necessarily prepared is if you get a paper towel or even a dish towel soaking wet and you wrap it around the bottle and put the whole thing in the freezer, the towel will freeze first and it's almost like this compacted ice enclosure for your wine, and it'll actually get your bottle cold in about 5 or 6 minutes, which is pretty awesome. But generally I would serve, my reds at about 60 to 65 degrees. I mean, no one has a thermometer going, but slightly colder than room temperature. And I think whites should be 5 or 10 degrees above refrigerator temperature. And I know a lot of people love their white wines and their rosés and their sparkling ice cold. There's nothing wrong with that. I like to pull mine out of the fridge for 15 minutes and then start drinking it. You take that little bit of chill off of it and you get a lot more aromatics, you get a lot more flavors going on. I just think the wine is more complex if it's not ice cold, personally.
Excellent. Good tips. Okay, we have a question from Ginny. She wants to know, what was Gerald Ford's favorite? Was he a wine drinker or did he prefer a scotch with Tip O'Neill?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, he made a point of showcasing American wines and had the great American winemakers. He paid tribute to them by having them come to the White House. If he were serving at a state dinner a wine, say made by an Italian American. And that was, by the way, one of the ways that to this day, we pay tribute to our guests. It might be the Prime Minister of Italy coming, and we serve an Italian wine, an American wine made by someone of Italian ancestry. And President Ford was very big on serving Mondavi wines and invited Robert Mondavi, the founder of that, to the White House. But I think the question about him having a Scotch with Tip O'Neill, given his beverage of choice, I think it would probably be more towards that.
Okay, great. Here's a question, might be controversial. Was there ever an instance where teens living in the White House engaged in wine drinking?
I couldn't say I found things that were reported, but there were examples. For example, when Teddy Roosevelt was president, for example, he had both of his daughters' debutante balls at the White House, and I found notes afterwards where the White House ushers said that the wine was flowing like the Potomac River for these young ladies and their guests for the debutante balls. But I don't know. I don't have evidence to say that the teenagers were definitely served wine. If there was, they snuck it downstairs someplace. So maybe they went to the cellar, which is one thing. I think Friends of Ford may be interested in the White House wine cellar. If you have ideas that there is a big mammoth tunnel with the arches and with bottles covered with dust and aging for decades, you're going to be in for a disappointment. When I worked there, I wanted to see the White House wine cellar, and I asked the guy in charge over and over again. And finally, one summer when everyone was gone, he said, "All right, I'm going to show you the White House wine cellar." Now, as I mentioned this book, I even have photos. The Queen of England has a wine cellar that has 38,000 bottles of wine in it. The Élysée Palace, the French equivalent of the White House, has a cellar with 18,000 bottles of wine. So anyway, I go down to see this White House wine cellar. There is no wine cellar. It's a closet. It's a very small pantry with room for maybe 300 bottles. And what's done today, so you're going to be heartbroken if you have this romantic image of the White House wine cellar. But what's done today is wine is purchased on an event by event basis. And they only buy enough wine for the upcoming state dinner or major event, and a few bottles in case the president has a guest over who wants a bottle of wine.
Okay, well, that is kind of a letdown. I was hoping for this grand
Yes.
illustration of this amazing wine cellar. I'm sure you were too. We've had a couple of questions from our audience, wondering if it was ever the way to do things, or if I guess it isn't now because we're serving American wines, but serving wines from the country of the person visiting, say at a state dinner. Was that kind of the way to do things? Do you have some stories about that?
Yes, I mean, there's one recent example. President Obama had the president of China at the White House for a state dinner. And it was the first and only time, but a Chinese wine was served, a Chinese rice wine was served as a tribute to him. But what's done more commonly is to pay tribute to that guest by finding an American wine that has an association with that country. And one that was really interesting for me involved President Bush, 43. And I saw 3 dinners and they caught my attention. One was the Bushes had been invited to England to be guests of the Queen of England for a state dinner. And part of that process when there's a state dinner is the president will host a reciprocal dinner the next night at the American ambassador's residence in Winfield House in London in this case. And I looked and I saw the wines, and they served 2 wines. They served a Newton Chardonnay from California and a Peter Michael Cabernet Sauvignon, also from California. Well, I looked and found the winemaker from Newton, Mr. Newton, was an Englishman who moved to the United States and who'd started a winery. So there was that tribute back to his home country. And Peter Michael Cabernet was Sir Peter Michael, who had been knighted by the Queen as an outstanding Englishman who owned this cellar. So that was 2003 at that dinner. I noticed then in 2005, Prince Charles, the Prince of Wales, and Camilla, his wife, came to the White House. And I looked at the list and they served the same thing, Newton Chardonnay and Peter Michael Cabernet. So I thought, well, that was interesting. And then 2 years later, 2007, the Queen and Prince Philip came to the White House for a state dinner, and the Bushes again served Newton Chardonnay, Peter Michael Cabernet. And I figured the word must have gotten out that the Queen was pleased with the wine selections because they were served every time she or her family came to the White House.
Well, hey, that's a good indicator, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay, question for Adam. Adam, this question is from Teresa, and it's simply corks or no corks?
You know, corks are porous, you know, so there's oxygen that kind of can travel to and from the wine. That can help a wine age for a long time, but it also allows for faults. I don't know if anybody's familiar with this, but sometimes you'll open a wine and somebody will say, this wine is corked. And what that means is it's developed a compound that makes it smell and taste like musty, wet cardboard, like grandma's basement kind of a thing. And if you seal a wine with a synthetic cork or with a screw cap, that will never happen. So I think it's very romantic to use natural corks. It's the way it's always been done. I think a lot of wine aficionados think that that's the only way that you can seal a wine. But in reality, a screw top wine is actually more fail-safe than a cork. So there's a lot of debate behind that. I love corks. I mean, what is wine without a cork, you know? But I understand why a lot of, especially lower priced wines, are going to screw caps because they're not meant to age for a long time. It's kind of just like pop and serve wherever you are. So I think there's room for both.
Which, Adam, leads me to a personal question. A lot of us have these 3 beautiful bottles of wine. Not all of us can finish them in one night. What are your tips for storing them over the next few days? After you open a bottle of wine, what's a great way to preserve it, at least for a couple days?
I mean, I think that's definitely debatable whether you can or cannot finish it. But I would say, I think that, you know, with the sparkling wine, if you don't have a proper champagne stopper, I would focus on that one tonight. If you're going to continue to drink and you enjoyed it and you want to keep going, because those, even after your first open, if you have a proper enclosure, they just never have that fresh pop from after the first time, which is unfortunate. The red wines, actually, if you're not going to drink them tonight, I would say put them in the fridge. And I know that sounds crazy, but like any sort of produce or food, it's going to go bad quicker. Did I say that right? It's going to go bad quicker than like leaving it on the counter than it would putting it in the fridge. So put it in the fridge tonight. If you're done with it, put the cork back in. And if you want to have it tomorrow evening, let's say, just pull it out 3 or 4 hours in advance and then put it on the counter and let it warm back up. But I definitely don't be afraid to put your red wines in the fridge if you're not drinking them that evening.
Great tip. I have never done that, and I will tonight. Thanks, Adam.
Honestly, elongate it for a couple days.
Excellent. Okay, this question is from Robert. What was the first Virginia wine served at the White House? We're thinking you might have mentioned something about Michelle Obama. Have there been Virginia wines served in the White House, and what was the first one?
Well, Virginia wine, actually, Thomas Jefferson dreamed of producing wine in America, in Virginia, that could be world class. And he had an Italian winemaking family member, a guy whose family had been in wine business for generations, that he partnered with, a guy named Philip Mazzei. And he got the cuttings to bring to the United States to plant, but he never was able to get his wine business off the ground. But today, Virginia has become a major wine producing area. There are hundreds of wineries now in Virginia. And the particular one that Robert asked about is called RDV. RDV, it's owned by a guy named Rutger, D, his middle name, and Vink, V-I-N-K, so it's RDV. And interesting story, how the whole wine comes a full circle. His property is on land that was surveyed by George Washington. So here's a winemaker today making wine served in the White House that our very first president surveyed the property so many years ago. And that one was one that Michelle Obama had experienced firsthand. But one thing maybe would be of interest is people ask, how are the wines chosen today that's served at the White House? Who picks those wines? And early days, as we talked about earlier, Thomas Jefferson, he was picking them. He was advising other presidents. He was telling Madison, he was advising everybody on what the wine should be. And it evolved through the years. It was kind of president's personal preferences. Nixon, as I mentioned, he knew what he liked. He had preferences. Reagan had a guy who he knew from his days as governor out in Sacramento, California, a wine merchant, and he would check in with him to see what wines he recommended for important events. And then they would send choices and he would make a decision. But today, actually, President Clinton was the first president to hire a professional from the wine industry, a guy by the name of Daniel Shanks, who was a wine professional from Napa Valley, who came to the White House as one of the chief ushers with his portfolio, including wine selection. And actually, he was kind enough to do a fascinating chapter for this book about how the wines are picked, how they're stored, how they open them, how long before the meals, how they measure the temperatures on each wine before they serve it, how they decant them. But he has picked the wines. Actually, he recently left, but he advised on the picking of the wines. And one thing about the White House now that's changed, the White House doesn't try to serve America's most expensive wines, or even necessarily the one that's been rated #1 by the wine experts as the best wine. They try to showcase interesting wines, and sometimes it's small producers who have produced something really great, and here they are. They can aspire to have their wine served at the White House by the president. And they have one rule, though: if your wine is selected to be served at the White House, you have to be discreet about how you promote it. Yes, you can let people be known. You can let it be known to people that your wine was served at the White House and who it was served to at a state dinner, that type of thing. But you can't go launch some social media campaign about the official wine of the president or whatever, or your wine will never be served again.
Okay, just a couple more questions from our audience. Mark and Terry, first of all, compliment to Gleaves. Great questions, Gleaves, they say. And their own question is, did the French wine blight impact presidential wines or diplomacy?
The more recently, the lack of supply of French wines, I guess, or well, I guess let me answer two things. There are two things that happened. One is, as Adam mentioned earlier, the wines that came to California came from France, and around the turn of the beginning of the 20th century, this insect, this very small insect, attacked the vines in Bordeaux and the major wine regions of France, called phylloxera. It essentially wiped out the wine regions of France, and that was a major blight on French wines. And what they did, though, talk about, again, full circle with other nations. The Americans had received their original wine stocks from France. The French then came to the United States, and the Americans gave them versions of the wine stock they could take back and replant in France. So the wines today produced in France are on wine stock that left France, came to the United States, and returned to France. And that did set back a bit. After World War II, when there were no imports of French wine, there was very little French wine served in the White House. And then I think there have been a couple of times where intense political moments, statements and examples have been made about not particularly showcasing French wines in the heat of that moment. But now it's not about holding back or refusing to showcase another country's wine. It's about saying, we're going to showcase the best of America. We're going to put American wines out front.
All right, and I think this will be our final question for the night. But real quick, I want to give Adam one more chance to tell our viewers, if there's a wine we particularly enjoyed tonight, where can we get those from?
Yeah, so I sell wine in Grand Rapids to various retail spots and also to a ton of restaurants around town when they were operating. So Rishi's International Beverage is the main place where we would set up all these packs, and he will continue to carry these wines. And that's on 28th Street in East Paris. One thing that I want to particularly mention, just because I'm very passionate about it, is with the first wine, I mentioned the Thomas Jefferson quote. and it's from an importer named Kermit Lynch. And Kermit Lynch is based in the San Francisco Bay Area, and he distributes wine throughout the entire country. And I really love his wines and encourage you to look for his name on the back of a bottle, because he only works with independent producers who farm thoughtfully, who it's just the old school way of making wine. And no matter what, his wines have a great price to quality ratio. But I would say, yes, Rishi's International Beverage is the spot to grab all of these wines and many more that are delicious.
Excellent. And for our viewers who are not in the West Michigan area, I know we can get these wines across the nation as well, correct?
Definitely.
Excellent. Okay, so final question is from Kristen, and I'm going to ask this question to you, Fred, but also to Gleaves, because I know he spent a lot of time with the book lately, and it might be hard to answer, but what is your favorite wine-related presidential story? And so for Gleaves, maybe favorite part of the book or your favorite takeaway?
Actually,
Sorry, go ahead, please.
my favorite part of the book is coming right up in a toast that I'm going to offer. Okay, so hang on.
Excellent. Fred, do you have a favorite?
Yeah, there was one thing that just kind of amused me. It was a small moment, but I could just I had to laugh when I learned about it, and that was President Tyler, our 10th president, had a group over at the White House that he was trying to impress. That it was very important for them to leave impressed with the evening. And the food was served, it was brought out, and it was awful. They couldn't even fake it. Everyone was moaning and complaining this food was awful. And he paused for a minute and he thought, how do I save this evening? So he went to the chief usher and he said, give me the keys to the wine cellar. And he gave him the keys. He took the whole group down to the wine cellar. They all pulled off their favorite bottles. They took the corkscrew and opened the bottles, and they sat down in the White House wine cellar, when it was a real wine cellar at that time, and drank until they couldn't drink another drop. And I thought, well, that's a memorable moment. It's a president who is being resourceful. He took a bad evening and he turned it around and made it into a great evening.
That's the way to save a party. What
Yes.
a good leader.
Right.
Excellent. Well, and Fred, before we close out the evening, please let us know again where we can buy your book. I'm sure a lot of our viewers are really interested to dig into these stories.
Well, it's available on Amazon. And it's also sold through the White House Historical Association. WhiteHouseHistory.org is that website, and it'll tell you all about the association and history. And it's also got the ability to buy gifts and other items that we're selling that reflect the presidency.
And Fred, I'm a teacher at heart, and I know that the proceeds from this book all go to the educational efforts of the White House Historical Association. So I want to make sure our viewers know that as well. And with that, Gleaves, talk to us about this toast that you've prepared. This has been a wonderful evening. Thanks for letting me be a part of it.
Thank you, Claire.
Thanks, Claire. Thank you so much to our thoughtful viewers. They were really great questions that prompted, I think, some really new dimensions of the way to look at wines in the White House. And Fred and Adam, before we close out, before we move to the conclusion, I just want to ask you, is there anything else either of you would like to add?
Well, go ahead, Fred.
No, I think Adam probably shares this view, but one thing I came away with writing this book is how hard the people work who make wine. That is the ones we enjoy on our tables, the ones that are served at the White House. As Adam mentioned earlier, you've got issues like fire and the damage that it could do. You're at the mercy of nature, and it's very, very hard work. And I know how proud winemakers are when their wine is showcased by being served by the President of the United States.
Yeah, it's a funny thing that wine is considered so bougie, for lack of a better word, when it's really like one of the most humble professions in the world is winemaking. It's painstaking work. I completely agree with you. It's really, really interesting to hear these stories. I got to peruse through the book. I thought it was awesome. I can't wait to get my copy. I don't have much to add. I really enjoyed doing this. Thank you for having me, and thanks for the insightful questions, and cheers to everyone.
Thank you, Adam. Fred, would you like to tell us about the historic glassware and decanters that viewers may have already seen in your camera view there? Weren't they discovered by White House Historical Association archaeologists, researchers?
Well, there are, it's an interesting part of our history that going back to the earliest presidents, while we were trying to show we were a real nation, we were a world power, and we were doing it through having a big White House and things like that. And these presidents were ordering these incredible sets of glassware that are engraved with crystal with the presidential seal and all. And that became, and in fact, on the cover of the book, I have one from James Madison that's been added to this. That is that photo is from a Trump state dinner, and the based on a Trump state dinner. And then we added stuff to give you the feeling of being in the seat of the president of the United States, including James Madison's decanter and some other things. So this elaborate glassware was made, and we featured a whole chapter in the book. But one thing the White House Historical Association did was say, why don't we recreate some of this? And the proceeds all go to the educational purposes. So you and I talked about, Gleaves, I've got a couple examples where we recreated the presidential seal of FDR. I'm going to hold up a wine glass, and you'll see there's the eagle surrounded by stars. That was FDR's version of the seal that he had when he ordered White House glassware. And then for the obviously 20th century Democratic president, for Republican fans or fans of the 19th century, this is the seal, a different eagle that Abraham Lincoln had on his glass. And we even went so far to have decanters made, this very elaborate cut glass with the Lincoln seal on it, the style of the Lincoln decanter. And for FDR and the 20th century, it's a much more modern decanter, again, with the seal, the stars on it. So for those who are looking for a Christmas gift to give someone, these are available only through the White House Historical Association website, and they're on their third order. So if you're interested in one, please order it, and it'll be a great gift for a wine aficionado.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Well, I think the time has come to offer a toast, and I hope everyone has a glass and a bottle of wine that's open and they can pour that glass right now. Fred, as you point out in your book, President Ford offered a rousing toast to British Prime Minister Harold Wilson when he was visiting the White House on January 30th, 1975. It happened to be the 10th anniversary of Sir Winston Churchill's funeral, so President Ford summoned the great wartime leader, saying, I'm quoting, "We are reminded of Winston Churchill's courage and hope in the face of great peril. He told the world in December 1941, we have not journeyed all this way across the centuries, across the oceans, across the mountains, across the prairies, because we are made of sugar candy," close quote. And how apt those words are today, 45 years later, after all that Americans have been through in 2020. Well, since we are not made of sugar candy, let's raise our glasses to toast the indomitable American spirit.
Hear, hear.
Thank you. By way of wrapping up, I'd like to thank our delightful presenters, Fred Ryan and Adam Fortuna, for sharing their passion for wine with us this evening. We've all learned a lot from you. I also want to thank two great partners of our Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, the Ford Presidential Library and Museum, as well as the White House Historical Association. Also, my gratitude to all our friends of Ford who joined us this evening. Thank you. It is you who make these programs possible. If you'd like to order your own copy of Fred Ryan's beautiful coffee table book, as Claire mentioned, go to the website of the White House Historical Association, because all that income from the sale of the book goes to support the great educational mission of the association, which was founded, by the way, in 1961 by First Lady Jackie Kennedy. Which brings me to my final point. Tonight's event is the last to be hosted by the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation in this strange year, 2020. And if you find value in the programs we host at the Ford, if in this difficult time in our nation's history, you believe it is important to advance the legacy and values that Jerry and Betty Ford represented, unimpeachable integrity, doing the right thing without relying on polls and focus groups to point the way, treating all with dignity, engaging in the good faith effort to find common ground for the greater good, formulating sound policies and communicating with candor to the American people. If the Ford's values resonate with your values, then please consider becoming a friend of Ford. You can do so by visiting www.geraldrfordfoundation.org, as shown on your screen. Go to where it says donate to learn more about how to support our rich and varied programs, and also to see some of the exciting speakers coming your way in 2021. So on behalf of everybody who has made this evening's presentation possible, I send you the season's warmest greetings, wishing you a Merry Christmas, a Happy Hanukkah, and a Happy New Year. Good night.